I never imagined that my best friend and my boyfriend could betray me. Looking back, I can see I was completely naive. My best friend and I had been inseparable for years. We shared everything from secrets to clothes, and there was never anything I couldn't tell her. She knew me better than anyone. Our friendship was a bond I cherished deeply, and I trusted her with every part of my life. She was the person I'd call if I was having a bad day, or if something amazing happened. It was the kind of friendship where we didn't need to say everything out loud to understand each other. Then there was my boyfriend. From the beginning, he was sweet, attentive, and seemed like he genuinely cared about me. He'd surprise me with little notes or gestures, and being around him just felt comfortable and safe. When he met my best friend, I was thrilled to introduce them to me. These were the two most important people in my life, and I was so happy that they got along. I remember thinking I was lucky to have both of them in my life. It felt like I'd hit the jackpot with two people who genuinely seemed to care about me. Over time, the three of us started hanging out regularly, and it felt easy and natural. They'd laugh together and have fun, which I initially loved because I wanted them to get along. But sometimes I'd catch small things that felt a bit strange, like inside jokes or little looks they'd share. I remember dismissing it as my imagination. I figured it was just natural that they'd have a few things to laugh about since they spent so much time together. There were moments, though, when I'd feel a weird twinge of jealousy or insecurity. I'd question myself, wondering if I was being paranoid. After all, this was my best friend and my boyfriend. What possible reason would they have to hurt me? I'd think they loved me. They'd never do anything to betray me. It was almost like I'd convinced myself that something like this just couldn't happen to me. Whenever that little voice in my head would hint that something was off, I'd push it away. I thought I was being insecure. I wanted to be the cool girlfriend and friend who didn't question things. I trusted them both with my whole heart. I was so focused on seeing the good in them that I didn't see the truth forming right in front of me. As time went on, I started noticing more and more things that felt off, but I convinced myself I was just overthinking it. At first, it was small, almost imperceptible changes. My boyfriend, who used to be so eager to spend time with me, began to cancel plans more often. It started with innocent excuses. He had work, he was too tired, or he'd promised to do something with friends. I tried not to think much of it. After all, we all have busy lives, right? I didn't want to come off as needy or demanding, but then it became a pattern. He'd say he was too exhausted to hang out, but when I asked about how his day went, he'd brush it off or give vague answers. His texts became shorter, and the frequency of our conversations started to dwindle. What bothered me even more was that when I asked if everything was okay, he'd assure me it was, giving me that typical "don't worry, babe" response. I should have listened to the nagging feeling in my chest, but I didn't want to seem suspicious or paranoid. I didn't want to be that girlfriend who overanalyzes every little thing. Around the same time, my best friend seemed to be pulling away too. We used to hang out all the time, just the two of us, but now it felt like she was always too busy or unavailable. She'd cancel on me with similar excuses: work, school, or other plans. At first, I thought she was just going through a phase, or maybe she was caught up in something else. But like with my boyfriend, I started to notice how often these excuses lined up. She'd always have a last-minute change of plans when we were supposed to hang out, or she'd be mysteriously unreachable when I needed her most. It felt like I was always the one doing the reaching out, and I began to feel like I was the one making all the effort to maintain our friendship. Then one day I overheard her talking about my boyfriend in a way that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't anything obvious, but the tone in her voice made my skin crawl. It was like she was too comfortable, too familiar with him. And when I asked her about it, she just laughed it off, saying I was imagining things. But the cracks were starting to show. I felt like I was losing both of them, but I didn't know why or how to address it. I felt alone, but I didn't want to admit to myself that my instincts might be right. I tried to push it all aside, but the feeling of something being off kept gnawing at me, and I couldn't shake it. One night, everything changed. I had no idea that a single moment would unravel everything I thought I knew about my relationship and my friendship. My boyfriend had left his phone at my place after we spent the evening together. I had no intention of snooping, I trusted him completely. But as I walked past his phone, something caught my eye. It was a message notification, and for some reason I couldn't ignore it. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just a work text or something unimportant. But my heart was racing, and before I could stop myself, I opened it. It was from my best friend. The message itself was harmless enough at first glance, but as I read it, my stomach dropped. The words seemed too familiar, too flirtatious for two people who were supposed to be just friends. My best friend had always been a little more forward with her words than I was, but this was different. She was using terms of endearment, saying things like "miss you" and "can't wait to see you again." At first, I convinced myself it was a joke, that it meant nothing. But then I scrolled up. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but once I saw one message, I couldn't stop myself from looking further. The more I read, the more I felt like my heart was sinking into my stomach. There were weeks of messages, private conversations that were far more intimate than anything I'd ever shared with either of them. They were planning to meet up secretly, making plans that I wasn't part of, and the messages were full of flirtation and promises. I could feel my hands shaking as I scrolled through the texts, the reality of what was happening hitting me in waves. It felt like my entire world had been flipped upside down, and I couldn't breathe. I tried to tell myself it couldn't be true. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered, something innocent. But deep down, I knew what I was seeing. The betrayal was right in front of me, and it was impossible to deny. My best friend, the one person I trusted more than anyone, had been sleeping with my boyfriend behind my back. I felt this rush of anger, confusion, and heartbreak all at once. How could they do this to me? How could they both lie to my face and treat me like I didn't matter? The trust I had built with both of them crumbled in an instant, and I didn't know what to do next. The moment the truth hit me, everything felt like a blur. I couldn't process what I had just uncovered. It was like I was living in a nightmare, but there was no waking up from it. I couldn't stop thinking about the messages, the lies, the secret plans. I couldn't breathe, my chest felt tight, and all I wanted was to confront them both, to demand answers. But I had no idea how to approach it. How do you confront the people you loved and trusted the most in the world when they've shattered everything you thought was real? After what felt like an eternity of pacing around my apartment, I finally decided I couldn't wait anymore. I needed answers. The first step was confronting my boyfriend. My heart was pounding in my chest as I waited for him to show up. When he did, he acted normal at first, as if everything was fine. But as soon as I looked him in the eye, everything changed. He knew something was off. His smile faded when he saw my expression. I didn't waste any time. I held up his phone, showing him the messages between him and my best friend. He tried to deny it at first, stumbling over his words, but the guilt was written all over his face. I could see it in his eyes, the shame, the regret, but it didn't change what had already happened. It was like everything I had known about him, everything we'd built together, was a lie. He apologized, saying it was a mistake, that he never meant to hurt me, but his words felt hollow. What was a mistake in this situation? The truth was, they'd been lying to me for so long, and now that the truth was out, it felt like I had been living in a world of illusions. I couldn't stay calm for long. The hurt and anger finally bubbled up, and I started shouting, demanding to know why they'd both done this to me. I wanted to scream, to hit something, but instead, I just sat there, feeling empty. He promised me that it was over, that it had been a one-time thing, but I couldn't believe a single word that came out of his mouth. How could I? Everything about our relationship had been built on trust, and now that foundation was gone. Next, I had to talk to my best friend. I didn't know what to expect, but part of me was hoping she'd be remorseful, that she'd be as devastated by what had happened as I was. I hoped, deep down, that there would be some sort of explanation that made sense, some reason for why they betrayed me. But when I confronted her, I realized I was wrong. Her reaction was cold, almost indifferent. She didn't seem sorry at all. Instead, she tried to justify it, telling me I was overreacting. That was when it really hit me. This wasn't just about a mistake or a lapse in judgment. She had made a conscious choice, and the betrayal felt even worse than I had imagined. I sat there in shock, unable to even form words. This person, my best friend, had no remorse. I couldn't understand how she could hurt me like this and still act so casually about it. That's when I realized I had lost both of them. Not just because they had crossed a line, but because they didn't care enough to feel guilty about it. The anger still boiled inside me, but there was also an overwhelming sense of grief. I had lost not just a boyfriend, but a friend I had trusted with everything. And that, in some ways, was harder to bear. The aftermath of everything was a blur. For days, I felt like I was walking through life in a fog, unsure of who I was anymore, or how to pick up the pieces of my broken heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been living in a lie, trusting people who never really had my back. It was hard to accept that two of the people I thought I could rely on the most had turned out to be the ones who hurt me the deepest. I felt completely betrayed, not just by my boyfriend, but by my best friend. The hurt was all-consuming, and there were days when I didn't know how to keep going. But somewhere along the way, I realized that I had a choice. I could let this define me and wallow in the pain forever, or I could find a way to heal and move forward. Slowly, I began to do the hardest thing I've ever had to do: let go. I had to distance myself from both of them, even though it felt unnatural. I cut off all contact with my ex-boyfriend and my best friend. I knew I couldn't continue to allow them to have any space in my life if I ever wanted to feel whole again. At first, I felt lost. I didn't know how to navigate life without them, especially because they had been such a big part of it. It felt like a huge chunk of my identity was gone, and I was struggling to fill that void. But over time, I started focusing on myself. I spent more time doing things that made me happy and learning how to enjoy my own company. It was hard, especially in the beginning when I still had flashbacks to the hurt and anger, but I knew I needed to do this for me. I surrounded myself with people who truly cared about me. I reconnected with old friends, the ones who never let me down. I began to invest more in my passions, the hobbies I had neglected in favor of my relationship and friendship. Slowly, I started to rebuild my sense of self piece by piece and learn to trust myself again. I realized that I had spent so much of my time depending on others for my happiness, but in the end, the only person I truly needed to rely on was me. The scars from the betrayal will always be there, but they don't define me. I learned the hard way that not everyone who enters your life will treat you with the respect you deserve, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't keep moving forward. I refuse to let their actions dictate my future. Every day is a step closer to healing, and while I may never fully forget the betrayal, I've come to understand that I'm stronger for it. I can live without them, and I will.